It was a hard blue afternoon when the wind moved through the high oak, and something above us sighed like fabric catching on a nail. Sunlight struck a small rectangle clutched in a pale hand, just a blink of reflected glare, and the forest went church quiet. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Most mornings before the heat built up, I walked the gravel lane behind our place and listened to the river. The South Fork moves in its own steady language, low in spring, talkative after rain, and for years it timed my days better than any watch. I'd stop by the diner on Main for coffee trade weather notes with the cooks and scan the ridge line the way old habits make you do. In a town like Luray, time is measured by porch bulbs and the first mower on Saturday by the church bell at 6, and the last pickup leaving the feed store at dusk. We knew the trail the way a lighthouse knows its water, not by ownership, but by a duty to watch. Sierra was part of that rhythm long before she put a camera to it. As a teenager, she'd show up at the trailhead with mud on her shins and a pack too big for her frame, smiling like the mountain had whispered a secret and she was trying not to spill it. She had a way of making people feel seen, thanking volunteers who cleared blowdowns, handing out warm cookies she and her mom baked for hikers coming off a wet week. Later, when the followers began to stack up, she still waved at the same ranger trucks and asked the same, "How's the water up on Jeremy's Run?" like the internet hadn't changed a thing. Donna kept her books from a desk wedged between the living room window and the smell of whatever soup she had going. Their house sits 2 streets behind the old depot, a square of siding with a porch swing that talks when you sit down. On school nights back when I'd see Sierra doing laps around the block training before the sun dipped, ponytail snapping like a metronome. After graduation, she kept moving. Local trails turned into weekend loops. Weekend loops turned into longer runs down through Georgia and back again. She learned camera angles the way other kids learned guitar chords, and before long there was money attached to her name gear. Companies' travel pages, the kind of offers that make a small town glance up. Spring 2023 arrived with dogwoods like folded handkerchiefs and a run of mornings in the low 50s. You could smell leaf mold waking up, that clean, dark scent that clings to your boots after a long climb. Sierra said hello to me outside the diner the week she was set to start north. She had a neat stack of brand-new kit in the back of her SUV, labels still stiff where they'd just been peeled. We stood there by the windows neon open, talking about water sources and late-season ice on the shaded switchbacks. She listened, but the bright part of her eyes was already miles away on a ridgeline she planned to film at sunrise. There's a way young folks talk now about the trail, quick cuts, clips likes, and I'll admit I don't fully keep up. But I understood what she wanted to show the old path to people who had never smelled balsam or watched fog pour off a saddle at dawn. She had the voice for it, clean, unhurried, and she could make a slick of wet granite look like a cathedral window. "I'll send my location every night," she told me, half promise, half habit. "Mom will fuss if I don't." I told her fussing was a kind of love, and she rolled her eyes, but didn't argue. I saw her again at the outfitter 2 days before she set a boot on Springer. She'd come in to swap a cookpot for a lighter one and left with a lens she didn't need. The kid behind the counter asked for a selfie. She obliged, sang out his name so it would land right in her audio track, and thanked him twice. When she stepped into the sunlight, I caught a flash of the girl who used to leave wet socks on the trailhead sign while she wrung them out and laughed. Fame hadn't sanded that down. It had only given her a larger room to stand in. Donna called that night to ask how often check-ins ought to be, every evening or only when service held. I told her what I tell all families: agree on a window, not a minute. Phones die, weather pouts, batteries lie. The mountain doesn't care about our clocks. She made a note of it, the scratch of pen on paper coming faint through the line. "I'll keep the porch light on," she said, and I could see it in my head, that pool of yellow moths humming their small collisions. Sierra started north in mid-March, where Georgia keeps the trail in a soft green cradle before the big work begins. Folks around here watched the miles tick up on her channel, the way we watch a storm track, curious, proud, alert. The clips were full of morning breath fog and the slap of boots on wood bridges, the crunch of late frost under heel. She spoke to camera like it was an old friend come along for the walk. In between, I heard the other music nettles whispering on her sleeves the clink of carabiners against a bottle, a creek shouldering its cold through shale. One evening a week in, I was on the back porch oiling my old Pulaski when my phone buzzed with her latest post-sunset on a bald all honey and brass. In the corner of the frame, a man in a windbreaker ducked past just a blur at the edge of light. Nothing to say it meant anything. Trails are public. Strangers pass through your pictures the way clouds cross photographs at the beach. Still, I watched a second time and noticed how the shadow moved, not hurried, not slow, just aware of the camera in a way most folks aren't. I told myself it was my job to notice patterns, and I let it go. The trail towns hummed through April. Trout season filled the parking lots at daylight. School buses threw dust on the back roads. Sierra messaged Donna from shelters and from picnic tables with cell phone bars thin as thread. When weather pinned her down, she posted from inside a tent, laughter muffled by nylon and rain. She was honest about the blisters, a thumbnail shot of a heel taped like a boxer's knuckle, and about learning to carry less. She was less honest about fear, which is a private thing, and often best kept so. I kept my usual rounds maintenance calls after wind, a Sunday talk at the Grange about map basics, checking the culvert where water always tried to bite the road out. At the co-op, old friends asked how long a young person could keep broadcasting their camp without inviting trouble. I told them what I believed most folks are decent, and the mountain teaches manners to the rest. Still on some nights, I drove an extra loop past the trailhead and let the engine idle while I listened. It's an old superstition of mine. The V8's soft thrum feels like a hand on the shoulder of the woods, a simple way to say, someone's awake. Mid-April turned fickle. Days climbed into the 60s, then a cold shoulder dropped out of the hills and pinned us back in the 30s by dawn. On a Tuesday, I helped Ranger Megan Hall talk a pair of college kids out of climbing a wet scramble they had no business on. They were grateful in the way young folks are when the adrenaline drains out slow. Megan mentioned not as a complaint, but as a weather report that more hikers were stepping off trail to film content places miles from any blaze. She said it like you'd note a new kind of mushroom popping up after a rain. Interesting, maybe useful, maybe not. I thought of Sierra with her tripod and the way she looked for solitude like it was part of the job. That Friday, I pulled into the gas station off US 340 and found Donna wiping the windshield of her sedan, a thermos of coffee balancing on the hood. We talked about her garden, which never listened to the calendar, and about the noise the dryer had started to make. She asked if long gaps between messages were normal once you got north of Swift Run. I told her there are stretches where your phone might as well be a smooth river stone, and she laughed, then bit her lip like she'd said more than she meant to. "I'll hear from her tonight," she said. She promised. There are promises parents hear the way others hear hymns. They're not contracts, so much as the sound a house makes when it settles comforting because it's familiar. By the end of the month, Sierra's clips shifted into places I know by smell as much as sight ferns that carry a peppery green, the sour sweet drift from a patch of charred laurel cold air pooling in gullies even when the sun warms the ridges. Her eye had sharpened. Less of the camera turned back on herself, more of it holding on the long look-do threaded on spider silk. A barred owl stepping sideways along a limb, a creek identical to the one in your memory, until you notice the light is different and realize it's the present, insisting on itself. One evening I was rolling a garden hose when a notification shook my phone. Sierra had put up a short clip from a creek I could name with my eyes closed. Rounded stones, a fallen birch with a scar of white bark. The caption said she'd be up before dawn to film from a ridge where the horizon opens in a clean northeast line. It was a pretty plan, and I respected it, and I felt something turn in my chest that I couldn't account for. It wasn't dread, not yet. More like that stillness before thunder when the birds practice quiet. After supper, I drove the long way home the way that passes the Blackwoods street. Their porch light was already on. Donna keeps it on a timer when Sierra's out the bulb soft as butter through the glass. Inside a shape crossed the living room Donna, probably holding a stack of papers. I thought about stopping, then didn't, because not every worry deserves an audience. I told myself the same thing I tell new volunteers. The woods hold more kindness than harm. It's true often enough to trust, and not true often enough to keep your pack by the door. That night a wind came from the west, dry and restless. It ticked the twig ends against the gutter and made the old gate click on its latch. I set my phone on the nightstand, turned it face down to keep the screen from waking me, and slid the window open an inch for cool air. Somewhere out there, a fox barked once and then twice, as if to check whether anyone was listening. I was. I always am. The next morning, the river wore a scarf of fog that lifted inch by inch as the sun climbed. I poured coffee, thumbed the news, and glanced at my phone for the familiar little dot that meant a check-in had landed while I slept. The screen stayed dim. I told myself she was walking under a canopy too thick for a signal that she'd be at the overlook by 8 and send a burst all at once, 3 messages stacked like planes waiting to land. I rinsed the cup, put it back upside down on the rack, and listened to the house. The clock on the stove ticked its brave little seconds. The porch bulb on its timer was still glowing in the daylight, a small sun in a glass globe no one had gotten around to switching off. By noon, the bulb was finally dark. The phone, though my phone remained still on the counter, face down, as if by not looking I could keep the day ordinary a little longer. Out on the ridge, a hazy heat already blurred the far line of trees. Somewhere up there, a camera waited in a pack for its moment. Down here in the kitchen that smells like coffee and old wood, the first inch of quiet began to pool in the corners, thin as water, and just as certain in its intent. The morning slid by without much meaning. I remember standing by the window, mug in hand, watching fog lift off the fields like a sheet being folded back. The world looked exactly as it always had, which is how most terrible days begin. Around noon, Donna called. Her voice had that tremor mothers get when they're trying not to sound afraid. She asked if the service might have gone down on the ridge, said Sierra hadn't checked in for almost 2 days. I told her it happened all the time. Signal dead spots, bad weather equipment failures. I believed it then, or maybe I just wanted her to. She thanked me, said she'd wait until the evening before calling anyone else. That night when I passed her street, the porch light was still on, and the air around it was thick with bugs beating themselves senseless against the glass. By the 3rd day, her silence stopped being explainable. Donna called again this time. No tremor, just a hollow steadiness that made me set my coffee down. She'd tried the satellite device, texted, even messaged one of those hiking groups online. No answer anywhere. I told her I'd drive out to Shenandoah in the morning and check the route where Sierra's last post was filmed. I didn't say out loud that I'd already looked at that post a dozen times, frame by frame. The creek she'd camped beside was about 15 miles north of the busy section most hikers stuck to. I knew the place a narrow bend with birch trees and a flat patch just big enough for one tent. I reached the ranger station at sunrise. The parking lot was still empty except for a government pickup that looked as tired as I felt. Ranger Megan Hall came out, mug in hand, hair pulled back, eyes scanning the map I'd spread across the hood. "If she's really out there," she said quietly, "we'll find her." We hiked to the site together that afternoon, moving slow, marking the trail with flagging tape out of habit more than need. The forest was the same shade of green it always was, indifferent, endless. When we reached the creek, the air smelled of wet leaves and iron. The ground was smooth, no sign of struggle or campfire, just a square of flattened moss where a tent had once sat. It was too clean, like someone had packed deliberately. Megan radioed in the coordinates, her tone clipped and official. Within hours, a search plan was drawn up, grids, foot teams, dogs, aerial sweeps. I stayed on as a volunteer because I knew the ridges better than most. For 3 days we walked those lines until my boots filled with grit. The dogs barked at old deer beds, and every scrap of fabric looked like hope until you touched it. Not a trace of her, no gear, no prints, not even a torn strap. The woods can hide a person, but not forever. That's what we told ourselves. By the end of the week, Sierra's face was on every bulletin board from Waynesboro to Front Royal. Her followers online turned restless hashtags, armchair theories, the whole noise of a world trying to solve what it can't touch. Some said she'd gone off-grid for content. Others whispered about accidents, bears, even human interference. I didn't read much of it, but Donna showed me messages she'd received. A few were cruel, accusing her daughter of faking it all for attention. People don't understand that grief doesn't get to choose its company. It invites strangers, and most of them don't knock before entering. The park filled with volunteers, men and women with day packs, retirees from the local hiking club, even a few of Sierra's fans who'd flown in from other states. They meant well, but the more feet that moved across those woods, the harder it became to read the ground. Megan set up a command post at the overlook where signal was best, and that's where I stayed most nights watching the ridges disappear into fog. I'd see Donna sitting in her car below, face lit by the dashboard, staring at her phone as if sheer will could make it ring. 2 weeks passed before the FBI got involved. I remember their lead agent, Curtis Hale, introducing himself with a quiet authority that filled the room. He carried that kind of stillness soldiers get when they've seen too much and learned to measure their words. He asked for every detail. We had timestamps, photos, messages, coordinates. Donna handed over Sierra's laptop, shaking slightly as she unplugged it from her bag. Curtis promised to treat it like a daughter's diary, not a case file. You could tell he meant it. Within days, they found what we'd all missed. The messages Sierra had been getting before she vanished, the ones she'd brushed off, weren't random comments from fans. They were written from dozens of fake accounts, all pointing back to the same signal source. Same grammar, same time of day, same turns of phrase. Someone had been studying her down to the minute she posted. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I'd spent half my life warning hikers about weather bears' bad footing, but never about someone who learned their habits from a screen. Curtis and his team followed the digital trail to a cabin about 50 miles south of the park, tucked into the folds of the Blue Ridge like a splinter. The name attached to the property was Blake Morrison. I didn't know him, but when I saw his service record, former Army Ranger discharged for behavioral issues, I could feel the air tighten around us. The agents went in first. I waited at the perimeter, listening to the wind comb through the pines. When they came out, their faces told the story before their words did. Inside that cabin were walls plastered with Sierra's photos printed and pinned in rows. Maps of the Appalachian Trail, her route traced in red ink. Notes, numbers, times, places. And a journal pages of obsession so methodical it made you cold just hearing about it. But Blake himself was gone. Truck missing. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him for weeks. It was like he'd melted back into the hills. I knew what that meant, the kind of man who can live invisible in the woods for months at a time, who knows how to move without leaving a print, who can wait longer than anyone else. Curtis called it what it was, a hunt. The search changed overnight. No longer a rescue, but a pursuit. Helicopters swept valleys at dawn. Thermal cameras mapped heat signatures that turned out to be deer. The media caught wind, of course, and every trail town filled with reporters asking the same questions. Was she alive? Was he armed? How could something like this happen here? I didn't have answers. None of us did. Donna came to the ranger station one evening near the end of May. The sky was bruised purple with stormlight, and thunder rolled far off, still polite. She handed me a photo Sierra as a kid perched on the hood of my old truck, holding a frog with both hands. She always thought she was safe out there, Donna said softly. Said the woods were the one place no one could reach her. I didn't know how to tell her that the woods can't tell the difference between peace and danger. They just hold what you leave behind. By June, the teams had covered hundreds of square miles. Heat built early that year, air thick enough to press against your chest. The flies were relentless. Every night I came home and rinsed the sweat off my neck, checked the porch light, and thought about how quiet it must have been where Sierra was. Sometimes I'd catch myself listening for her voice in the wind the way you do for someone you know isn't there, but wish they were. The investigation stretched into July. Tips came in citing sounds, campfire smoke on distant ridges. Each one ended in nothing. Curtis stayed late most nights, his jacket draped over the back of a chair, the hum of his laptop the only light in the room. He didn't talk much, but one evening he told me about finding more evidence in Blake's files, photos of other women, all hikers, most alive and well, a few who'd gone missing and later been found safe. The pattern was there. Fixation, then withdrawal, then fixation again. Until Sierra. When the funding for active search ran out, the park quieted. Volunteers went home. Donna stayed a few more weeks, then left flowers by the creek where Sierra had camped last. I walked there a few days later. The moss had grown back. The air was still the kind of still that feels earned. I stood for a long time, trying to imagine what she saw, last trees, like pillars, sky through branches. Maybe the feeling of being watched without knowing why. Summer turned into fall. The leaves flared and then dulled, same as they always do. Life for most people went back to its tracks. For us, it didn't. The case file sat open in Curtis's office, and every time he called me in, it felt like we were reaching into darkness with the same small light. Then, sometime in November, the first hunter reports came through broken branches, a strange smell. An area deep in George Washington National Forest where no one usually goes. The coordinates didn't mean much at first, just another lead. But something about the tone in the caller's voice made me pause. He said, "You need to see this yourself." That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind carried that dry rustle only late autumn brings, and every sound seemed to hold its breath. I sat at the kitchen table, map spread open, tracing my finger over the coordinates the hunter had given. It was almost 100 miles from where Sierra was last seen. I stared at the contour lines, tight, steep, unforgiving. A place you wouldn't stumble into by chance. A place someone might choose if they wanted never to be found. I folded the map, turned off the light, and let the dark settle around me. Somewhere beyond those ridges, the truth was waiting, and it wasn't going to be kind. The hunters met us at the ranger gate just after sunrise, 2 men from Augusta County who looked like they'd slept in their truck. One kept rubbing his hands together even though the morning was warm. They'd followed a wounded buck off a fire road deep inside George Washington National Forest and stumbled on something they couldn't make sense of. The younger one said, "You'll know it when you see it," then turned away and stared at the tree line. I didn't ask more. Some things explain themselves the moment you arrive. The drive-in took nearly 2 hours over rutted dirt that tried to shake the bolts loose on every turn. We left the vehicles and hiked the rest boots, grinding through frost and last year's leaves. The air had that hollow metallic cold that lives in shaded valleys even in late November. When we broke through the last stand of oaks, I stopped breathing for a second. High in front of us, about 20 feet up, hung what at first looked like a tangle of fabric caught in a storm. Then the light shifted, and I saw her hair moving in the breeze. It's strange how sound changes when shock sets in. Everything around you seems to fall away. No birds, no wind, just the slow hammering of your pulse. Megan was the first to move. She stepped forward, raised her binoculars, and lowered them without a word. Curtis said quietly, "Secure the area." That's all. No dramatics, just the weight of it. We set up perimeter tape, though there was no one for miles. The forest was so still it felt like it was listening. They called for a recovery team, but it would take hours to reach us. In that time, the rest of us did what we always do: photograph, mark, document, try to keep emotion from leaking through. but you can't look at something like that and remain the same person who walked in. She was suspended by a network of cords, vines, and torn cloth that looked deliberately woven. Whoever did it had taken time, measured, careful, almost ritual in its precision. Beneath the tree, the ground was cleared, swept even like a stage someone had built and then abandoned. When the technicians finally climbed up to bring her down, I stepped back. There's a kind of reverence you feel in moments like that, a quiet that belongs more to churches than to crime scenes. They lowered her gently, wrapped her, and began collecting what evidence they could. That's when one of the techs called out softly that something was still in her hand. It was a phone caked in dirt, but surprisingly intact. He passed it down, and I remember how cold it felt, even through the gloves. Curtis took it without a word, sealed it in an evidence bag, and said, "We'll deal with this back at base." The hike out was longer than the hike in the trail, narrowing to nothing as we carried her through the trees. A few times I caught sight of sunlight flashing off the bag she was in, and for reasons I can't explain, I kept thinking about that porch light Donna refused to turn off. The same soft yellow, the same quiet plea for her daughter to come home. Back at the field office, the phone went straight to the digital forensics unit. I stayed nearby, not because I was needed, but because I couldn't bring myself to leave. Hours later, one of the techs looked up and said there were video files that hadn't been overwritten. The phone had powered on just long enough to capture a handful of clips. The first was a familiar view of trees, the lens shaking her voice, whispering something about finding a chance to run. The last clip. I won't describe in detail. She was alive, barely speaking directly into the camera, naming him. She said his full name, her tone faint but steady, and gave landmarks she thought could help. Then the screen went dark. That changed everything. The coordinates in the phone's metadata pointed to a section of the forest nearly 100 miles from where she vanished. A place no ranger patrolled because there was nothing there. No roads, no trails, no reason for anyone to go. We mobilized before sunrise. Helicopters, ground teams, even drones. Curtis rode with me in the lead truck. He said very little, just kept his eyes on the map, one hand resting on that evidence bag like it might vanish if he let go. When we reached the area, we spread out along an old logging path, half swallowed by brush. It took only a few hours to find it a mound of dirt, too, even to be natural, covered with branches and dead leaves. Beneath it, the entrance to a shelter expertly camouflaged. We went down slow flashlights sweeping over plywood walls, canned food, military surplus gear. And then the restraints, steel brackets fixed into concrete padded cuffs, still bolted in place. My stomach turned at the sight. You can study crime scenes for decades and still not be ready for the kind of cruelty that plans ahead. Everything about that bunker spoke of control. Supplies labeled and dated. Shelves lined with water jugs, freeze-dried meals, even a small generator vented through a false tree stump above. In one corner sat a desk with a laptop battery pack and a stack of printed photos. All of Sierra, some candid from her channel, others clearly taken without her knowing. Angles from the trail zoomed from distance, and one of her sleeping by a campfire. There were also pictures of other young women hikers, all with public profiles, all taken in similar ways. A few had notes underneath, follows similar route posts, daily, same tent model. Curtis called for evidence bags, his jaw tight. We cataloged everything, and each new find made the air heavier. On a shelf above the bed was a journal in the same hand we'd seen before in his cabin. The pages were dated and detailed, describing what he called companionship sessions. But it was torture, written in polite words. He'd convinced himself that these women were part of some wilderness experiment he was conducting. There were passages about compliance training, acceptance milestones, all twisted language meant to justify what he'd done. I stepped outside for air. The forest felt different now, smaller somehow, like it had been keeping this secret too long, and was finally exhaling it. The sound of helicopters pulsed over the ridges. From a distance, they looked like slow-moving beetles circling a wound. We spent the next 2 days combing through the area. Hidden caches turned up miles apart, buried barrels filled with weapons food, and chillingly women's clothing sealed in plastic. The evidence suggested he'd prepared for more than one captive. That realization sat like ice in the gut. The manhunt reignited with a force I hadn't seen since my active years. Roadblocks went up across Virginia and West Virginia. The FBI released a statement urging anyone with hiking experience who resembled the profiles in his journal to avoid the Appalachian corridor. Curtis coordinated from a mobile command post, his voice level but eyes red from lack of sleep. Every night, the search grid expanded, and every morning, new reports came in false leads, smoke from old campsites, prints that turned out to be bare. Blake Morrison had vanished like he'd rehearsed it. His military background gave him every edge. He knew how to live off the land, how to evade heat scans, how to move at night without light or sound. The mountains were his ally, and he'd built them into his escape plan years before any of us knew his name. For weeks we tracked hints of him, discarded wrappers, a half-burned match footprints that faded in rain. Each one led to another dead end. Meanwhile, the world outside the forest was unraveling. Sierra's story had gone national. Reporters filled the trail towns, and every diner booth held a theory. Donna stopped watching the coverage. She said hearing strangers dissect her daughter's last moments felt like losing her twice. I didn't blame her. Some nights I turned off the radio halfway through updates just to keep from shouting at the air. By early winter, exhaustion took hold. We'd covered more ground than any search I'd ever been part of, and still the man was smoke. Curtis kept saying, "He'll surface." They always do. I wanted to believe him, but the longer it went, the harder it was to picture. Until one afternoon weeks later, when a quiet alert came through the federal network. A public computer terminal in a small West Virginia library had logged into several of the fake accounts we'd traced to Blake. It seemed impossible, why risk it? But obsession doesn't vanish. It demands to be fed. Agents moved fast. The IP pinged again an hour later, then went dark. By dusk, a SWAT team surrounded a homeless shelter on the edge of town. Blake had checked in under a false name, using a veteran's ID he'd stolen years before. He didn't fight when they found him, just raised his hands, calm, as if the waiting was finally over. I wasn't there for the arrest, but Curtis called me that night. His voice was flat. "We've got him," he said. Then a pause. "You were right about the kind of man he was. He planned for everything but loneliness." When I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long while, listening to the night insects rasping against the window screen. Relief doesn't feel like joy. It feels like air finally reaching your lungs after months underwater. Yet even then, I knew this wasn't the end. We'd found him, yes, but what he'd done, what he'd built out there, would ripple for years. The mountain would heal, the trail would green again, but for the rest of us who'd walked those woods, the silence would never sound quite the same. Somewhere deep in those trees, the echo of a young woman's courage still lived in the videos she left in the fight she managed with the strength she had left. And as the cold wind moved through the oaks that winter, it carried a truth none of us could shake, that even in the vastness of the wild, the worst kind of predator can look almost human until he moves. The first time I saw Blake Morrison in person, he didn't look like the monster we'd built in our heads. He was smaller somehow, ordinary in a way that unsettled you more than if he'd come in snarling. He sat across the table in a federal interview room, hands folded neatly, eyes pale and steady, like he was waiting for a business meeting to start. Curtis stood beside me, arms crossed, saying nothing. The air hummed with the quiet of machines recording everything. When the agent finally read him his rights, Blake gave a slight nod as if he'd been expecting every word. When asked if he understood, he smiled a thin, wrong kind of smile and said, "Perfectly. There's something eerie about hearing a voice you've only imagined." I'd pictured it gruff, broken, maybe slurred by drink. Instead, it was calm, deliberate, almost polite. He spoke about Sierra as though she'd been a partner in some shared project, a willing participant who'd simply lost faith. He used that phrase 3 times. Curtis stopped the interview twice to collect himself, walked to the hallway, breathed, came back in. I stayed seated watching Blake's hands. They never shook. When he described the months he kept her in that buried shelter, his voice didn't rise or fall. It was the tone of a man explaining how to pitch a tent or sharpen a knife. I'd seen many kinds of evil in my career, but this one, the cold-ordered kind, was something else entirely. Later, when we finished and they let him out, he glanced back at me through the glass and said, "You keep the woods safe, Ranger." The guard pushed him forward before I could answer, but I did answer quietly after he was gone. I said, "Not from you." That night I drove home in silence. The highway was empty, except for a few truckers running their routes. Somewhere past Harrisonburg I had to pull over and sit a while. The fog was rolling down from the hills, wrapping everything in that soft, colorless light that feels like the world is holding its breath. I thought about Sierra, about those last recordings on her phone. How much strength it must have taken to press record, knowing what was coming. I'd seen bravery before, but never one that quiet. The weeks that followed were filled with hearings, forensics reports. The FBI cleared out the shelter piece by piece, cataloging every scrap of evidence. The pictures, the journals, the maps, each item, another nail sealing the case. Curtis said it was the most meticulous crime scene he'd ever seen, every corner of it proof that Blake had been preparing for years. They found more caches buried across 3 counties, all marked on maps in his handwriting. The man had built a life of anticipation, waiting for the day he'd feel powerful again. When the trial began, the courthouse overflowed. News vans lined the street cameras, craning for a glimpse of him in shackles. Donna sat in the second row every day, her hands clenched around a small photo of Sierra as a child. She never spoke to the press, never raised her voice. She just listened. I was there too, sitting behind the prosecution table taking notes I didn't need to take. The prosecutor, a woman named Daniels, laid the evidence out like a path through the forest, methodical, step by step. There was no room for doubt. When she played Sierra's final video, the courtroom went silent except for the soft whir of the projector. Even the guards looked away. Blake watched it without blinking. When it ended, Daniels asked if he had anything to say about what the jury had just seen. He said, "She misunderstood what I was teaching her." That sentence hung in the air like the stench of something dead. From where I sat, I saw Donna's shoulders tremble once, then go still. She never looked at him again. It took the jury less than 4 hours to return with guilty on every count: kidnapping, murder, cyber-stalking, obstruction. Life without parole. Curtis and I stood outside afterward, neither of us saying much. The air smelled like rain about to start that electric charge that makes you think of lightning long before you see it. He finally said, "You think he ever knew what he was?" I told him yes. Monsters don't hide from the mirror. They admire the view. The sentencing came a week later. I'd thought the trial was the end of it, but that hearing, that was something else. The judge, a man who'd seen his share of horror, spoke slowly as though weighing each word. He said Blake's crimes were not acts of impulse but of intention, and that intention stripped him of any right to freedom or mercy. When he finished, the gavel came down soft, almost kind. The sound barely reached the back of the room, but to me it was louder than thunder. Afterward, Donna walked out into the hallway and leaned against the wall, eyes closed. I asked if she wanted me to call anyone. She shook her head. "I just want to hear the wind," she said. We stepped outside together. The breeze carried the scent of cut grass and diesel from the courthouse generators. She looked up at the sky, pale blue, streaked with cirrus clouds, and whispered, "It's over." I didn't correct her. Some lies are mercies. Over the next few months, the world moved on the way it always does. News crews left. Reporters found other tragedies to feed on. But the trail changed. Hikers started posting less often using code words for their campsites, blurring the backgrounds of their photos. Park offices held safety workshops that filled every seat. Donna started a foundation in Sierra's name funding GPS beacons and trail training for young women. I helped when I could paperwork logistics a few speaking events. I never got used to saying her name in past tense. By spring, the forest had started to heal. You could see green pushing through the burned scars, hear the streams running full again. But the quiet out there wasn't the same. The woods used to hum with a kind of trust, a rhythm between people and nature that felt eternal. Now there was something sharper underneath a thin wire of caution. Every time I heard laughter on a distant trail, I caught myself turning to listen twice. One afternoon, I was clearing debris after a storm when Curtis called. He said they'd found a small camera hidden near one of the old camps Blake had used. Inside the memory card were photos taken weeks before his arrest, selfies, maps, and one last entry in his digital log. It read, "They will remember me." That was his closing act. Not apology, not reflection, just a promise of infamy. I deleted the file myself after they'd archived the evidence. Some memories don't deserve to live longer than they already have. That night I drove up to Skyline Drive. The air was cool, the valleys flooded with low fog that glowed silver under the moon. I parked at an overlook and cut the engine. For a long time I sat in silence, letting the hum of cicadas fill the emptiness. Somewhere below the trail wound through the darkness like a thin scar. I thought of Sierra again, the way she waved that last morning outside, the diner, sunlight catching in her hair, her laugh echoing off the brick storefronts. I thought about how sure she'd been that the wilderness was a friend, not a threat. And I thought about how thin that line really is between freedom and danger, between beauty and terror. Curtis once told me there's no such thing as closure, only containment. You build a box big enough to hold the pain, and you learn to carry it without spilling. I think that's true. Some nights when the wind shifts just right, I can still smell the damp earth of that hollow where we found her. It's faint now, but it's there, a reminder that peace isn't the absence of darkness. It's the will to keep walking through it. As I sat watching the fog drift across the valley, a faint rustle came from the woods behind me, just a deer moving through brush, nothing more. But for a heartbeat, the old tension returned, that reflex to listen to make sure the world was still as it should be. Then the sound faded, and the forest exhaled again. I started the truck headlights cutting through the mist and eased down the winding road toward town. The porch lights of the valley appeared one by one, small and steady in the distance. For the first time in a long while, I let myself believe that maybe those lights were enough, that in remembering her, we'd built something that would outlast him. But as I drove, I couldn't shake one thought. The woods had shown us what it could hide. And though we'd found one man, I knew deep down, there were others out there watching, waiting for someone else to walk alone. It's been 3 years now, though some days it feels like 3 weeks. The world moved on the way it always does, slowly at first. Then, all at once, while the rest of us were still learning how to live inside the quiet Sierra left behind. The headlines faded, the footage disappeared into archives, and even the trail itself swallowed its own scars. Grass grew over the tire ruts from the search teams, and the wind filled in the silence. Out there, the land doesn't remember in the same way people do. It just endures. I stayed on with the Park Service for another season after Blake Morrison's conviction, more out of duty than purpose. Curtis returned to Quantico training agents on digital tracking. Megan transferred to Yellowstone, saying she needed a place where the mountains felt bigger than the memories. Donna, she stayed in Luray. She still runs her little bookkeeping office out of the same house, the one with the creaking porch swing. Every spring, she sets a lantern out at dusk just like she used to when Sierra was on the trail. She says it's not about grief anymore, it's about light. Something to remind her that the dark doesn't get the last word. The Sierra Blackwood Foundation became real faster than any of us expected. It started small fundraising dinners at the high school gym, donated tents, and safety beacons talks about digital awareness. Then one day, out of nowhere, it caught momentum. Sponsors joined, outdoor companies offered grants, and the first scholarship went to a young woman from Tennessee who wanted to study environmental science. I remember shaking her hand and thinking how much she resembled Sierra, the same spark, the same stubborn hope. I didn't say that aloud. Some things are meant to stay unspoken. For a long time I struggled with what the story had taken from me. I'd spent decades teaching people that the woods could heal them, that nature, for all its dangers, was a kind of refuge. But after Sierra, I found myself second-guessing that message. I'd walk a familiar ridge and feel a chill, wondering who else might be out there unseen, waiting for someone who trusted too much. It took me months to remember that the danger wasn't in the land it was in, what one person carried into it. The trees weren't complicit. They were witnesses. I still see her sometimes in the ordinary ways memory plays its tricks. A flash of red hair on a switchback, the faint echo of laughter carried on the wind. Once on a foggy morning near Big Meadows, I found a small cairn, 3 flat stones stacked carefully on a stump. Hikers build them all the time, but this one had a small charm tied to the top with paracord, a silver feather, the kind you'd find on a bracelet. It was nothing extraordinary, but I took it as a sign that remembrance doesn't always need permission. The trial's end didn't bring peace, at least not right away. Blake sat through sentencing like he was watching someone else's story unfold. He never apologized. The system gave him what it could, life without parole, but justice is a blunt instrument when weighed against the kind of suffering he caused. You can lock a man away, but you can't undo the time he stole. Curtis once told me that closure is just a word people use when they've run out of questions. I think he's right. We didn't get closure. What we got was endurance. In the years since the trail community has changed, we've added check-in stations, encouraged hikers to delay posting locations until they're long gone, built mentorship programs pairing experienced backpackers with first-timers. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy even established an annual safety seminar in Sierra's name. I spoke at the first one. The microphone felt heavy, and my voice caught once when I said her name out loud. I told them the truth, that wilderness demands respect, not fear, but awareness, and that human evil, not nature, had taken one of our own. Donna came to that seminar. She sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, a small silver feather pinned to her jacket. When I finished, she stood and thanked the audience for not forgetting. Later, she told me she was learning to hike again, short local trails for now, maybe longer ones later. She said the mountains still scared her, but she wanted to reclaim them. He doesn't get to own the woods, she said. She loved them first. That line stuck with me. I think it will forever. Some evenings I drive up to the same overlook where I used to watch the search teams fan out years ago. The valley stretches below, quiet and endless. There's a new plaque there, now bronze, set into a granite stone near the trail sign. It reads, "In memory of Sierra Blackwood, whose courage lit the path for others. Nothing flowery, nothing grand. Just truth, the way she'd have wanted it. When the light hits it near sunset, the metal glows like warm honey, and the reflection spills across the ground like fire. I often wonder what she might have done with the life that was waiting ahead of her, the places she would have seen, the people she might have helped. I think of her mother's laugh, that soft Virginia drawl when she tells a story, and I know that some part of Sierra lives on through that sound alone. Maybe that's what legacy really is, the parts of us that keep talking after we're gone. Blake will spend the rest of his days in a concrete box, and even that feels too gentle for what he did. But I don't think about him much anymore. Evil doesn't deserve the energy it feeds on. Instead, I think about the ripple Sierra left behind, the scholarships, the safety courses, the strangers who learned to look up from their phones and really see where they were standing. Every time a young hiker straps on a beacon or sends a delayed message to their family, a thread of her story is woven into theirs. Last year, a group of volunteers organized what they called Lantern Day. At dusk, dozens of us gathered at the trailhead with small paper lanterns lit from inside. Each one carried a name, not just Sierra's, but every person who'd ever gone missing on that stretch of the Appalachian Trail. We stood in silence as the lanterns floated upward, tiny stars rising through the dark. For the first time in a long while, the air felt kind again. When Donna's lantern lifted, she whispered, "Go on, baby girl." I had to turn away. I've learned that grief isn't something you overcome. It's something you learn to live beside, like a creek that never stops running under the ground. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it roars, but it's always there, shaping the land around it. Every time I tell Sierra's story, I'm reminded that remembering is its own form of resistance. It's how we keep the light from dimming, how we deny men like Blake the erasure they wanted to leave behind. I don't hike as much anymore. The knees don't like the climbs, and the solitude hits different now. But when I do go out, I bring a small lantern with me. Not the electric kind, just a candle in a glass jar. I set it on the trail at dusk, watch it flicker against the wind, and think about how far that faint glow can reach. You'd be surprised how steady a little flame can look when everything else around it goes dark. So that's where I'll leave this story, on a ridgeline at twilight, with the wind coming up from the valley and the scent of pine carrying through the air. The forest is quiet, not because it's empty, but because it remembers. Every echo, every breath, every name we refuse to forget lingers here. Sierra's among them, steady, brave, unbroken. If this story stayed with you, share it, not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. And if you've ever walked a quiet trail and felt something watching over you, maybe it's just the memory of those we couldn't save reminding us to keep the lanterns lit a little longer.